in 1949. So with an 8-day-old daughter, they left everything that they had in Turkey and they went to Israel. They resided in the Rehavia neighborhood of Jerusalem, which is now very affluent. At the time, my father and his siblings grew up very, very poor. They grew up in a one-room home with a dirt floor. And so my dad grew up with this mother, my savta, whose name is Simcha, cooking essentially what they had in order to feed a family of 8 children and 2 adults. My dad came over in 1972, really because he's the 4th boy, and his 3 older brothers had all gone into the construction business. They owned their own companies, and my dad sort of read the tea leaves and was like, I'm gonna end up working for my brothers. And my dad was a very independent person, and so instead he got on an airplane, said he was going for a trip to visit a friend, and then just moved to America. My dad used to tell this story, whether it's true or not, that he found a $100 bill on the ground at Logan Airport and thought to himself, this must be what America is made out of. So my dad then washed dishes in starting in a hospital and then in restaurants for 5 or 6 years, and ended up with a friend of his opening a pizza place. My dad owned 17 restaurants over the course of his lifetime, many of which were during my lifetime. He never owned 2 at the same time, and he never owned one for more than 2.5 years. So at this point, as soon as the Chubby Chickpea, which was my very first business, turned 2.5 years old, I'd owned a business longer than he had. And as soon as I opened my second place, I'd held on to 2 at the same time. I always said my dad opened and closed places, and I only got the opened side from him. But my dad was just, if it wasn't going well, he was failing quick. And if it went well, he was selling it. And I spent for most of the last 12 years getting advice from him to either give up or sell, one or the other. But yeah, so my father mostly opened Israeli restaurants. And so I grew up sort of looking up to my father, who was a chef, and seeing like how he was able to touch people's lives and transform community and be such a pillar in every scenario that we were in. And that was something that I really like aspired to be. So I don't think I'd ever really thought that I would become a professional chef, but I knew that I wanted to sort of touch people's lives and be a part of community in that way. So when I graduated from college, I ended up managing 2 different small businesses in very different industries. And then my dad roped me into partnering with him in a pizza shop. And then he actually had to go in for a pretty major surgery, and he wasn't going to be able to work in the restaurant anymore. So it was going to fall into my lap, and I had no interest in pizza, to be frank. So I put up a banner that just said, "Coming soon, the Chubby Chickpea." And I realized the day before we opened that I'd never fried a falafel ball by myself. So I called my dad, who had not yet had this surgery, and I was like, "Abba, I need you to come and teach everyone how to make a falafel ball." And so he did, and on day 1, we opened I'll never forget the opening day for the Chubby Chickpea. I show up, so my dad had roped me into going into this business with him because my wife and I had just bought a condo in Canton Center. We've been living in the city, and my dad went and signed a lease on a space 150 yards from my front door. So I ended up, for the 3 years that we were at that space running the first Chubby Chickpea, my commute was 150 yards. So I remember the first day, instead of going in the back way, I walked out to Washington Street and walked down the main street, and there's 40 people standing outside front of the restaurant. I mean, this is 2 hours before we open, and again, I don't think I was ever prepared for what we were gonna do. So then I opened the Chubby Chickpea, and we were serving this Israeli street food. And being like a 24-year-old kid who college educated, thought I was smarter than everybody, I had kind of like wanted to infuse this corporate philosophy. And so I remember I wrote a mission statement, which is only funny to me looking back because of sort of how Israeli cuisine has changed so much in the last 12 and a half years. I remember on the wall of our staff room, it was written that our mission statement was to popularize Israeli cuisine through a consistent customer-first experience. Because to me, what was missing from between the connection of this food that I'd grown up eating and sort of like the mainstream was how I was packaging this in a way that everyone could relate to. I talk a lot about food because it's something I'm very passionate about. So I think almost all food is sort of the same. Richard Branson says about business that like if you give him 2 weeks, he can break it down and show you how every industry is exactly the same. We're just selling grain and rice for money. I think the same is often true about almost every cuisine. I actually sometimes say that the only exception I can really think of is Indian food, and I think that's why it's genius that Indian restaurants came up with the lunch buffet, because I think like they figured out that if folks don't try, if they're afraid to try this, they're not going to eat our food. Other than that, I think almost every cuisine can sort of like, we do very similar things. So I never felt like Israeli cuisine wasn't popular because of the food. I always felt like it's just that everybody that sold it was like my dad, you know, and it was intimidating to the average non-Israeli and non-Jewish consumer. So I remember like when we opened the Chubby Chickpea is when I became very, very aware of the cultural difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardic. I had grown up so my mother converted. So I actually have, and my wife converted. So my kids are really like 25% Jewish, but they are fully Jewish. And I look like this because my mom's half European, but I have no Ashkenazi background. So growing up in my house, the only real awareness I was of the cultural difference was that my dad used to say to me, if I wouldn't eat hot peppers, he would say, "What are you, Ashkenazi?" And so, but here I was selling this food, and it was confusing to consumers. It was confusing to the food media what to call it. They wanted to call it Middle Eastern food, and I sort of balked at that. And then they wanted to call it, Arabic food. They didn't understand. They weren't going to call it Jewish food, I guess is what I'm saying, because to them Jewish food was sort of like kugel and knishes, and this is like where their head went. So I remember realizing that there was this void in the food culture that belongs to us, in that we were not sharing this really beautiful, soulful thing that belongs to us with the food community. And so I remember where I was standing when I decided that I was going to start Simcha. And I was in my kitchen at home and I was cooking for my children, and I was realizing that I was cooking the food that like my father cooked for me, not the food that he sold, but the food that he cooked for me. And I realized like no one's doing this. Like this needs to be out there. And so I started a pop-up series in Roslindale, and I decided to call it Simcha. And my reasoning was, I knew that like the Chubby Chickpea still is the most important business I have to me and to the company I've built, but it's 100% serving the food of my father. Like these recipes are my father's recipes. We've tweaked, we changed the falafel to have whole seeds in it. Other than that, we've never changed that. We never changed the hummus, the tabbouleh. Everything's my father's recipe. With Simcha, I decided to sort of skip over my dad and go back to my grandmother and go back to the food that like my father was never taught to cook. He learned from his mother. He watched, and he had never actually sold professionally because, I don't think he understood how to introduce it to the community. And so I started this pop-up series, and I started sort of doing something really traditional and also really Israeli, in that the flavors were there, but everything was totally unique to us. And I remember being quoted and I was lucky enough to be featured in an article with a handful of Israeli chefs. And actually, I noticed the distinction was that I was the only one in the group that hadn't been born in Israel. And they asked me, they said, what makes your food Israeli? So to take a step back, my father used to get asked this question all the time. People would say, what makes that Israeli? My dad was very, very funny, and he used to make everything. My dad is, a big difference between the two of us is I love other people's food very much. My father never ate a meal ever without saying he could have made that better. So if like we went to Chinese, my dad would decide that he should be making Chinese food and we shouldn't go to Chinese restaurants. We should eat his Chinese food. So my dad used to make these egg rolls, and he used to tell people, these are Israeli egg rolls. And so my dad's line, when people would say, what makes it Israeli? My dad would say, I made it. That's what makes it Israeli. And so what I said in this article, which sort of shaped some decisions that I've made in Simcha and in Ala Esh, which is our barbecue concept, is they asked like, what makes food is Israeli? I said, well, it's not the flavor profiles, and it's not the seasonings, and it's the decision to make it completely unique. It's the idea that like, I don't want to make the same food that you made and the same food that you made. And, you know, we all know the joke that like, if you have two Israelis, you have three opinions, right? And that's so prevalent in our food culture. And it's why I argue that Israel is the most diverse and innovative food culture in the world right now, because there are so many cultures that have mixed, and there isn't the need to copy each other. So I think one thing that happens in the Boston food scene is that something gets hot and then every restaurant wants it. So like I always tell people, there's only one dish I would say no one in the world is gonna mess with me on. No one cooks shakshuka better than me in the world. But you go to like hipster restaurants and there's shakshuka on the menu. And it's like, you could ask them, why is shakshuka on your menu? And the only reason is because it's hot on Instagram, or it's right. Now, to be clear, I go back to my original mission statement, and I feel like we've won. Because if shakshuka is on that menu, then I guess we've popularized Israeli cuisine through a fast, consistent customer service experience. But so when I opened Simcha, I also made some like really innovative decisions, I think, that again, were really unique to me and my personality. And I would argue the folks that send me emails and tell me why this makes it not Israeli, I would argue actually it's even more Israeli than you think it is that I'd been to, so I had the pleasure of meeting Mike Solomonov and then being invited to his restaurant and eating his food in Philadelphia at Zahav, incredible restaurant. My favorite is Dizengoff actually, but I love Zahav. And I've been to Alon Shaya's restaurants and gotten to know Alon a little bit. And at the time, they were willing to introduce shellfish. But they hadn't introduced pork. And for me, my restaurant was meant to sort of mirror the Northeast and the food that I grew up around. And I grew up actually in a kosher household until my early teens, but then I was let to go explore the world. And I personally eat some foods that's what I eat. So it was on my menu. And to me, I take a lot of pleasure now actually in that both of those gentlemen have cookbooks out that have pork dishes in them. And Israel is changing. Israel is way more secular than people recognize, and serving a lot of cuisine that, you know, by definition is treif. And so to me, like Simcha was open to push. And so we were really, really lucky and honored to be called the best restaurant south of Boston our first year. And then due to COVID, they didn't actually give the award in the second year. And then they named us best restaurant south of Boston again in our third year, which is really unusual because generally these are sort of like competitions for views. And so they're usually given to like whoever's really super hot at that time. And it was really an honor to be recognized in our third year again. So we closed Simcha in June for the summer. Everybody's having staffing issues, and we're currently like readying the reopening. And I look at like what we're going to do with the next chapter. So this book recognizes our first year in business. Every recipe in this book is something that we served at Simcha in our first year. Some we continue to serve, some make their way in and out of the menu. We write the menu at Simcha every single day. And so, you know, there's certainly things that we draw from and pull from, but the idea in the room, I don't have a lot of Israelis that work for me, but I want everyone to think like an Israeli. I want everybody thinking like, I want you to want to be better than me. I want you to look at yesterday's menu and I want you to think that like you should be putting Israeli lo mein on the menu or egg rolls. When I opened the Chubby Chickpea, the first year, my dad would help me out sometimes. He was there one time, and this Haitian gentleman came through the front door, and he didn't speak a lot of English. And there's a really well-known in that area sushi restaurant, Takara, like 2 doors down from us. So he comes in and he's asking for sushi. So the kid at the counter is getting ready to try to explain to him that Takara is 2 doors down, and my dad goes, no. I'll make you sushi. So my dad goes over and we make at the Chubby Chickpea brick and mortar, we used to make these laffa. So he makes him a laffa full of chicken shawarma. It's big and and he sells it to him. And the guy like walks out and he must have enjoyed it. So till the day that brick and mortar was, we opened a food truck and closed that brick and mortar. For 3 years, at least once a month, sometimes once a week, this gentleman would come through the front door and order the sushi. And I used to have to explain to my staff what he meant by sushi. And I used to laugh at the idea that someday someone's gonna serve him sushi and he's gonna be like wildly disappointed in the size. but that was definitely like, again, and my dad just looked at it like, make him great food and everything will be all right. I think my business ethics are a little different. I would probably not do that, but that's sort of where Simcha came to be. And then again, like it's opened up a lot of doors for me to be able to introduce the idea of Israeli cuisine to folks. Again, like dishes obviously are important, and making great food is super important in the restaurant industry. But for me, I don't cook only to make things taste really delicious. I call food that tastes like great, but doesn't really do anything to you, I call it sociopathic food, right? It doesn't feel anything and it makes you feel nothing. I eat food to be changed. And when I eat a great meal, sometimes that's street food, sometimes that's at someone's house, sometimes it's really high-end cuisine. When I eat food that makes me look at an ingredient different. Has anybody ever been to Sweet Basil in Needham? So Sweet Basil in Needham is a restaurant that like changed the way I looked at food. And I've become really close with the owner over the years just by being a fan. I was not a fan of beets. I think I grew up like with beets being something that was like cold and pickled. And that wasn't for me. But the first time I ever enjoyed beets, they were seared and they were warm and they were in pasta. And that was just like strange to me. And then I loved it. And so like we serve a dish called dukkha beets, where we boil beets till they're soft, and then we shock them, and then we slice them small, and then we sear them hard. So they're crispy on the outside and they're soft on the inside. And then we serve them over farmer's cheese with like this nut and seed blend. And it's nutty and it's crispy and it's warm. And it's just like, I get really excited when people who tell me they do not like beets enjoy those dishes. And what happens every single time, if there's somebody I know enough or see in the community enough to have a follow-up conversation, they'll end up telling me they eat a lot more beets now. It opened the door. They looked at a beet differently. We smoke sweet potato. And people will ask like what that is, or we sear carrots. So here's a good example of where I think Israeli cuisine can be so special. So growing up, my father made carrot salad that he would call Moroccan carrots. So, and they were like rounded, medallions of carrots, and they were cooked, but they were cold, and they'd be served cold, and I loved them. They were great. So I went to Shia, Alan Shia's first restaurant, which he's not associated with anymore. I always really need to say that because it's funny to me to see on his social media when people are like, I'm in New Orleans and I'm gonna go to a Shia, and he has to do the weird dance where he's like, I actually own 2 great restaurants in New Orleans. The one that has my name on it, I'm not affiliated with. But so we ate these carrots, and they were just like super like crispy and delicious, and they were called Moroccan carrots. And I found it fascinating. I was with a chef friend of mine, and he was saying it was fascinating to him because Alon was trained in French kitchens, and so this was a French technique that he had taken, and then he had reintroduced some Moroccan flavors to it. So I took it back, and I introduced the flavors of that salad that I've been eating my whole life to this dish. And every single time, and we put like local honey on it. And every single time somebody orders it, they're like, was that sweet potato fries? Like they're so crispy that like you don't even know they're carrots. We've changed this. We've transformed this dish. And to me, like that's the idea, is like, I love what you did here, and let me try to do it differently. Instead of like, hey, and that's why I write in my cookbook, actually, like I want to inspire you with this. I had the privilege of being out in California last winter doing a few engagements like this, and at one of them it was a Shabbat dinner, and they had a local caterer cook the meal from my book. And that was a really amazing experience to sit down and eat food that that I had created, reimagined by a professional who sort of put their touch on it. And it was so funny because one of the dishes they made was totally different than I would do. But I loved it. I really loved it. And so the caterer, she came over to me and she asked me like what I thought. And I was telling her how much I loved her fish, and she kept calling it my fish. And I was like, no, that's your fish. And but it was beautiful. And it was really, and that's what I always like hope people get from a cookbook like mine, is like, look at food differently, learn, like maybe I did something you didn't know how to do. Now you know how to do it. Now take that and put your own spin on it. You might make something way better than I did. And then I might eat it someday, and it might make me better. And then maybe my food will get better, and we'll all have a good time. So, that's sort of like the way that I kind of envision food. And that's that's the way that I try to push things. And that's why I think some people, if anybody follows my career at all, I think I'm a little bit crazy in the sense that like, so I opened the Chubby Chickpea and I'm serving Israeli street food. And then I opened Simcha. I actually, in between the two, I opened a mobile beer truck company, which I love also. Doesn't fall into the genre, but it's a really fun thing to have. And then Simca's like super high end and sit down. And then we go to, we call Alash Israeli inspired Southern barbecue. And the thing is that like all of our techniques, I worked with a pitmaster who has won a world championship, a Jack Daniel's world championship. And, you know, I think I'm a pretty decent cook. And so like, and I'm a fast learner. So like I can work with someone and I can learn. We make really, really fantastic on its own right barbecue. And then there's a lot of similarities in Southern barbecue when it comes to like flavor profiles and techniques and Israeli cuisine. And so we do these like things that like you would get if you're Israeli and you might not even get if you're not. And you might just think it's great barbecue. And I enjoy that. I don't like forced fusion. I like organic fusion. Recently, I opened a brand called Hummus for Hummus, which is actually like named after an inside joke at the Chubby Chickpea, because oftentimes if you order a falafel in Israel, I don't know if you've ever ordered a falafel in Israel, they put tahini all over it and generally not hummus. And at the Chubby Chickpea, we put hummus in it. And so Israelis will come to the truck and say hummus for hummus, like chickpeas and chickpeas. And yeah, that's the way we make it. And you know, it's delicious. So when I opened a hummus bowl place, I was like, we should call it hummus for hummus, chickpeas and chickpeas. Plus that way Americans understand from about 100 yards away what we sell. And that helps sell food. So yeah, we opened our first one of those in Brighton, and then we just opened Chestnut Hill 5 or 6 weeks ago, and we opened Sharon 3 days ago. And that's like, to me, that's the coolest one yet, because it takes like all of this Simcha level food, like all these salads and spreads, and it just makes it so that like it's a salad bar. You could just walk up to it, and we just charge one price for the bowl, depending on what the protein is. You can put whatever you want in. And that's really how we eat. So like it, you know, and so we're always pushing, and I don't know what the next one will be. But somebody in my team is always coming up with some angle that they're throwing at me, and I'm going like, oh, let's do that this way. So that's sort of like the culmination. And as long as I'm cooking professionally, I always want to be pushing the next thing forward. I've got incredible teams who will keep cooking the food that I created last year. And I wake up every day inspired and excited to make something new and fun and innovative. So that's sort of me in a nutshell. That's the creation of Simcha and my book, my worldview on food. Does anybody have any questions? There's the part I enjoy the most. This is never my wrap up. The part I enjoy the most is questions. I feel like the best conversation is when you ask me some questions. Okay. Mike Solomonov's film. Yeah, so you know, it's funny. You're sitting here talking about your friend Susan, and I'm going like, she sounds so familiar to me. And both in her name and also in the way you described her, that's where I met Mike. And he pulled me aside and he was like, you need to come to Philadelphia and you need to eat with me and and my wife and I went to Philly and we ate at all now he has 4 restaurants in one day. And that's exactly where I know her name from. Yes. So that's what a small world connection, right? It's a beautiful community. It's a nice thing that I'm trying to decide if this next thing, how controversial I want to make this morning. Listen, driving up here, it's been a minute since I was in the Marblehead Swampscott area, but I said that so Chris Gigas is our culinary director who wanted to come out on a Sunday morning and prepare lunch. And I said to him, I said, that store right there should be a hummus for hummus. It's like, so we created this concept it's my favorite menu. It's also my favorite business because it needs a vanilla box. It needs nothing else. Everything's prepared in our commissary kitchens every day. And so it moves out. Email it to me. I'm really that impulsive. So like, that's why I hesitated to answer that, because like, I'm also somebody who, like, if I say it, I stand on it. So like, if I say the answer yes right now, then I really will. And like, I've gotten to a point where I've built my company in a way that I intentionally surround myself with a few people who can tell me to stop it. But I'm very serious, I'm very serious about doing it. I would think Chestnut Hill, just because it's the furthest north that we've gotten so far. We're moving north. We're moving. Brighton, I guess, is technically slightly north, actually, sort of. So in Brighton, it's at the Charles River Speedway, which is, so like, if you know Brighton at all, I actually used to live in Brighton Center, so I think of it as coming from Market Street, but Soldiers Field Road, where Soldiers Field Road hits Western Ave, we're right there at that corner. And it's actually a kind of interesting place to go. If you're going to go eat, I would recommend going when it's a warm day out, because our only seating is in the courtyard. It's a very cool project. It's like a closed courtyard where Notch Brewing has a like 5,000 square foot brewery, and then Koji Club has a really, really cool sake bar. It's a nice spot. Sharon is the only place that has indoor seating. Chestnut Hill is takeout only. There's some seating outside, and hopefully as we like work more and more with WS development, there'll be some outdoor seating area. But that's hummus for hummus is sort of like very small footprint is what we're going for. So we'll see. I mean, I'm currently talking to somebody about a Simcha space that would be closer, wouldn't be all the way up here yet. I do, yep. So the chubby chickpea, we call our busy season. We operate all year round, but we call our busy season April to November. And so like right now, that team is probably like in like kind of dial it back a little bit, get things fixed, figure, they're out a couple times a week, but not as busy. So like they don't have a set schedule at the moment that I can name. But the nice thing about being mobile is we can be around for sure. We actually have 3 chubby chickpea food trucks at this point. So having, that's a good place to start, right? It's easier for me to have a food truck come up here than it is to open hummus for hummus or certainly Simcha. But again, like I have big plans. I enjoy opening places. It's exciting for me. One of the things that's cool about having my kids at the age they're at now is like they are right now where I remember so fondly growing up in my dad's restaurants. So like the other day, my son had a half day. It was the second day that Hummus with Hummus Sharon was open. And my son's school is like right around the corner. So I had gone to pick him up. He had a half day, and I just stopped back in, and they were absolutely slammed. And so I was like, they were running out low on a few things. So I just went back to the kitchen to prep, and my 9-year-old son just joined the young lady at the register. And then he was so happy doing what he was doing that I was able to prep for 3 hours. So he then now thinks that he's gainfully employed as a cashier. So I asked him if I could pay him in hummus bowls, and he told me no. So that's where like we'll have to negotiate that, because like I can't. Why would I pay 2 people to do one job? I love him, but I can't do that.
So I'm assuming when you were kids, your classmates and friends weren't eating the same time as you would eat at home. What was that?
Yeah,
Did you notice that? What was that like for you?
that's a great question. So and that is such a measuring stick as to how far we've come, because right, like when I was growing up, none of my friends, and I grew up in Sharon, which at the time was 76% Jewish. So like all my friends were Jewish, and they had no idea what I was eating. They didn't understand it. It was weird. It was different. And now like the food my kids eat, like all their friends are familiar with, and Sharon demographically has changed quite a bit, actually. So their Chinese and Indian friends are familiar with Israeli cuisine in a way that my Jewish friends were not. And yeah, it was funny. So my dad filled me and I have a twin sister. So my sister and he filled us with this pride and belief from the day we were born. So like, people ask, who's Israeli here? And I say, I am. And they say, you're Israeli? I say, by passport. My dad, like, it was important that we be Israeli citizens. He gave us very Israeli names. I meant to comment when I came up that this is probably the first time anyone's ever pronounced my last name and my restaurant name both correctly in an intro. So I appreciated that. Some people say Shemtov, and then they think I'm Russian, which would be great to be, but I'm not, and I'm Israeli. But so my dad just filled us with like this immense belief that where we come from and who we are was a beautiful thing to be. And so I never felt growing up like being different was bad. I always felt like being Israeli was special. It's a big piece of my identity. It's actually funny because I get into these. I was a philosophy major in college, so like I get down this road sometimes. But my identity is much more tied into being Israeli and in that way being Jewish by culture than it is into being Jewish. Like in my mind, I'm Israeli before I'm Jewish. And that's, again, I think why it was important for me that Simcha feature dishes that I think like sometimes offended people. I just believe that like the Israeli culture is, and not just Israeli, but all of the cultures that make up the Jewish people are in their own right just really incredible cultures. I think what sometimes if I open a door here that we may or may not want to walk down, I think sometimes what happens to the Jewish people is that because the thing that we talk about that unites us is our religion, which by the way is a spectrum, right? Like we all have a very different relationship to God and to religion, but because that's the thing that we say unites us, it makes it others us in a way that's different than if we said like, what I mean when I say I'm Jewish is that like this is the community I come from. This is what I believe. My belief in religion and my relationship to God belongs to me and my children and my wife. But that's not what we mean, right? And I think other religions, when I learned about them academically, when someone stands up and says I am a Christian, they're actually telling you something like a choice they've made, a proactive decision. So they don't necessarily understand what we mean. And so when I say I'm Israeli before I'm Jewish, I just mean like that's the culture I was raised with. My dad didn't spend to him, being Israeli and being Jewish is the same thing. So my dad raised me with like, we're Israeli. And that's my tie to my Judaism is that like I'm Israeli. And although there are Israelis that are not Jewish, when you tell someone you're Israeli, I think they understand what you are and what you mean. But I think that definitely has driven some food decisions for me because I'm not, when my wife converted, my mom converted Orthodox. When my wife converted, she converted like, I'm trying to remember what the movement is called, but like on the scale of severity, less than reform. And so, but this incredible rabbi, his energy was incredible, Lev Bayesh. And he said to me one time, we were talking about our view on something, and he said to me, he said, the less religious Jews are, the more they're tied to some like really specific things, because in their mind, it's the only thing that separates them from being Jewish. My father gave me the name Avi Shemtov. You can't take my Judaism from me. Like I walk into a room, I'm Jewish whether I think I am or not. And so because of that, like the fact that I serve pork in my restaurant doesn't make it not a Jewish restaurant. But for some folks it does. And I accept that. I don't open it to offend them. I'm just okay with the fact that it does, if that makes any sense. And I say that that's as Israeli as it gets. So definitely shakshuka is number one. In particular because like there's such a communal aspect to that. So like for me growing up, sakhlab, if no one's ever had sakhlab, it's essentially dairy milk thickened by what is the flour? It's not rose, orchid, or by orchid flour. So, and it's thickened, and a lot of times people shortcut it by using cornstarch, which you can do, but sakhlab is technically orchid flour, and then you put like nuts and shaved coconut and stuff on it. So for me growing up, that was like, if it was a snow day, my father was serving sakhlab at the table, and for me that's shakshuka. So like my kids know it's like in my busiest of seasons, they wake up to the smell of shakshuka, they know I'm off. And they know like we're all gonna eat together and be together. Other things that I love cooking at home, some of which are not very Israeli, I love making pasta from scratch. That's something I just enjoy doing. It's easy for my kids to kind of get involved in. So they enjoy that. Chamin, if you've never had a chamin, Ashkenazi culture makes a very, very similar dish, cholent. But I describe chamin as like cholent with like a lot of soul. It's like, and my dad would make it with, my dad would make it with tripe, and I don't eat tripe. So like from a very early age, I was making hameen myself because I wasn't going to eat tripe. That's just not for me. Those are probably the biggest things that I enjoy making at home for myself. It's funny because like the foods that I sell, like grape leaves or hummus, or I'm just going to take from the restaurant. Like they're just things that take so much work. I'm not going to sit down and do them. We never make falafel at home. It's just, to make this much falafel and to make this much falafel is the same effort. It's just so much work. But to make it in bulk is actually pretty easy. Yeah, absolutely. So today for lunch, we have I think it's a cool menu as far as like how Israeli is it. So we have a grilled romaine salad. We have eggplant rollatini. We have probably the number one dish at Simcha, which is fried Brussels sprouts with tahini and feta cheese. And then, and by the way, all this food was prepared by Chris Skikas, who told me not to mention his name. But he's the culinary director at the Shemtov group, and he makes me look very, very good. People tell me all the time how great my food is, and I pretend I did it all by myself. And then the last thing is, and this is probably like the dish that I think embodies Simcha the absolute most, is pumpkin baba. So we envision Simcha. Like imagine a world where I had 12 Simchas and they were in different regions and each one of them tasted so different. So like I did a dinner for 38 people in Austin, Texas once, and it was Simcha, was the flag we were flying. And so like we cooked like very Texas barbecue inspired dishes. So like, have you ever had kibanaya? Do you know what kibanaya is? So kibanaya is lamb tartare, fine chopped. And then it's usually served with, so then you mix it with bulgur wheat, and then it's a lot of times it's served with an egg. Or so when we were in Texas at Simcha, we do that with tuna. So we do tuna where we chop it fine, mix it with bulgur wheat, and then serve it on kanafe or shredded phyllo as like a crispy bottom. So we're kind of emulating like a spicy tuna roll. In Texas, we chopped lamb, and then we finished it at the table under a glass dome with a smoke gun. So it was like smoked raw meat, which was just like kind of like our Texas spin on it. So pumpkin baba is a baba ganoush with no eggplant. We do to a pumpkin what we do to eggplant, and then turn it into baba ganoush. And so for us, like no one had done that before us. So and it also is so New England, and this time of year is like a really good time of year to do it. So that's the first thing I see next to the pita there. All right, I appreciate it. Listen, I feel like that has to happen because like the fact that the stars aligned for me to be here when you honored your friend Susan, who then introduced me to Mike Solomonov indirectly, who sort of put me on a different path, and I feel like it's just like it's sort of kismet for it to happen. So someday we'll walk before we run, but thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Patty McQueenie, the other co-chair, and the one who has the bad luck of coming after the chef and keeping you from eating. I will be very brief. First of all, Avi, thank you so much. That was terrific. Loved hearing about it. And I just want to say, I didn't know Susan, but listening to what I heard about her, she was obviously a wonderful and delightful person who enriched so many lives, and how nice it is that all of you are here doing her really this simcha. So thank you. Please, the cookbooks will be on sale. Come to our next event Wednesday night. The author is B.A. Shapiro. The book is Metropolis. Now, go eat.